Welcome to the Superstition Mountains. It's obviously, as you can see, late at night and it's very dark out here. I'm out here to do some ISO testing on my camera systems, that being the GFX100s and the X-T4. So what I want to do is see how they respond to different ISOs in the dark or in low light situations for like astrophotography. So an ISO variance or ISO variance basically means is if I take a picture at a given f-stop, let's say f4, at a given shutter speed, f30, and I set the ISO at 100 and I take an image and I do the same thing, so f4, 30-second exposure, I set the ISO 5 stops higher at 3200, then I take those two images and I put them into my raw processing software and I increase the exposure value on my ISO 100 image by 5 stops. How different do they look? Do they look the same? Are they especially with respect to noise? If they look the same, they're basically, you can look at it as an ISO invariant camera system. If they look very different, then it's ISO variant. This is just good to know because now in the future, when you take pictures, you can understand what you need to do for those images. So I'm out here, I'm going to set up my cameras and I'm going to go through and I'm going to take a series of images at a fixed aperture, fixed shutter speed, and I'm going to just vary the ISO on each camera and take a series of images, and I'll go back and I'll set up in my raw processing software and I'll go through those and I'll see how they look compared to each other. So next, I'll just go ahead and get my camera set up and we'll see what we get. Okay, so I've got the Fujifilm GFX100s with the 23mm f4 lens on it, and I have the aperture set at f4, I have my shutter speed set at 15, and I'm starting at ISO 100. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to take a series of shots at 100, 200, 400, 800, all the way up in one-stop increments, all the way up to 100 and 2800 ISO. That way I can look at the whole spectrum. This should give me a good idea of what the ISO and variance of this camera when I go in back and process it in the studio. So I've got the GFX images taken care of. Now we're working on the X-T4. So I've got this set up. I've got the X-T4. I've got the 16mm f1.8 lens on there. I've got the aperture set at 1.8. The shutter speed is at 15 seconds. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go 100. I'm actually going to go 160 on this one, and then 200, 400, 800, and so on through all of the ISO settings. So I got everything taken care of. Got the GFX100s pictures taken, I got the X-T4 pictures taken, and now I'm just going to be packing everything up and heading back to the car, putting this all into the computer when I get home. Hello, and now we're back at the office so we can look at the images that we took out in the field on the computer here. So as you recall, I used my GFX100s and my X-T4, which I'm recording on right now, to take a series of images at the same shutter speed, the same f-stop, and varying the ISO. And now what we're going to do is look at those images to see how much variation when we adjust the exposure level in post-processing we get with regards to noise. So let's dive in and take a look and see what we got. Okay, so this is the GFX100s images, and this first image we're looking at, this is at 3200 ISO, f4, for 20 seconds. Those were the main settings that I used. This I'm using as kind of my base image, and I have this in Lightroom. So now I have adjusted all but the last two. So if I go to this image here, which is Same settings, f4, 220 seconds at ISO 100, and it's basically black, but it's 5 stops below 3200. So if I take that and I increase that by 5 stops, this is what we get. So now we're going to go to the highest exposure, which is ISO 100 and 2400. And we're going to decrease that by -5 stops. And this is what we get. So now, if I go through and I compare these and look through them, all these images look pretty much the same in the large scale. So let's look at them in a tighter zoom, kind of zoomed in a little bit more on them. And we'll start with the ISO 100 image. Not too much, a little bit of change, a little bit of brighter in the ISO 200, but not too much of a change. 400 looks really clean. 800 still looks very good. 1600 looks good. So 3200, which I used as my base, so that's at 0 adjustments on it, still looks pretty good. By the way, keep in mind that I have done no noise reduction or anything on this. This is just straight out of camera into Lightroom. 6400 looks fairly good. 12,800 still looks good. 25,600 we're still looking, still holding good. 51,200 is still looking fairly good with regards to noise. And finally, at 102,400 ISO, we still are looking good, even after dropping down the exposure to -5. So what we're seeing is very little change in the noise between when we've kept everything the same, f4, 20 seconds shutter, and we varied the ISO, leading us to believe this is probably a very invariant ISO camera system here with the GFX100s. There seems to be a little bit of a change between ISO 100 and ISO 200 with regard to a little bit of the color, but not too much. So this is pretty good. It means the GFX 100s is a fairly ISO invariant camera system. So now let's take a look at the X-T4 camera. Okay, so these are the X-T4 images. Now the first thing you'll notice is that they're brighter. That's because I used the 16mm f1.4 lens, and I shot these at f2 15-second exposure. Once again, I did 3200 as my base ISO. I've already adjusted all of these. So we have 4 higher and 5 lower on this system. And we'll go through and take a look at it. So let's start at the ISO 100. Now one thing to keep in mind, base ISO for the X-T4 is 160 ISO, and I don't have that image in here, so we're just going to go with the 100, which is actually in the low setting. Okay, so this is the 100 ISO image, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, 12,800 ISO, 25,600, 51,200 ISO. There's a couple things that jump out at me on this. First off, there's a little bit of banding in the image when I go into the lower ISOs up to about 800. It's 1600, it's just about gone, and at 3200 it's pretty much clear and it stays pretty much the same throughout. Now let's take a look at these zoomed in the noise to see what we really have. Okay, so at 100 ISO, 200 ISO, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, 12,800, 25,600, and finally 51,200 ISO. So all of the X-T4 images look fairly similar with regard to noise. There is a bit of banding at the low end, and then it goes away at about 1600 ISO. What that likely means is that we probably have a dual gain processor system in there, dual gain system, that is changing over somewhere between 800 and 1600 ISO. It's not a huge change, but it is a bit of a change, and you probably would want to stay on the higher end, stay above 1600, because then you can bring things up, whereas if you're at 800 and you brought it up, it might not be so useful. Full disclosure, I shot this video over multiple months, and there are probably some discontinuities in the sequences and the films, and I do apologize for that. Just that's kind of how it happened. But let's go through the results. So for the GFX100s, when I looked at the images at ISO 100 and raised them by 5 stops and compared them to the 3200 ISO image, they looked almost identical, especially compared to noise, almost identical. Did the same thing, through all of them at 102,400 ISO and brought that down by 5 stops and compared it to the 3200. Once again, looked almost identical. What that tells me is the GFX100s is a very ISO invariant camera system. Now, that being said, it probably has a dual gain processor system in it, which means that at the low ISO settings, it uses one amplifier. At the higher ISO settings, it uses a second amplifier. And the switchover on that is likely in the 800 to 1600 ISO range. I don't know exactly the range. If you happen to know, let me know in the comments. I'd really appreciate it. But that's about what we know. What that means is, most likely with this camera for shooting astrophotography and such, I would probably shoot it at about 1600 ISO or higher, so I don't go across that changeover point. I could probably do some more testing and try and find that exact point, but at this point I don't quite know. So I just stay at about 1600 and higher. So the X-T4 system worked really well too. So once again, ISO 100, raised it by 5 stops, looked at 3200, almost identical. ISO 51,400, or 200, I'm sorry, and dropped that down by 4 stops compared to 3200. Once again, almost identical. Really very similar, meaning that it's very likely an ISO invariant camera system, which is really good, especially if you're doing a lot of astrophotography. There did appear to be some banding down at the low ISOs when I raised them up. This was kind of from about 200 to 800 range and such. What this likely is telling me, again, is that it's likely a dual processor system, meaning it's got one amplifier for low ISO settings, another amplifier for higher ISO settings. And somewhere between 800 and 1600 ISO, it's switching over, because the banding seemed to go away at about 1600. Once again, if you know the exact switchover, you know that, please leave me a comment, let me know. So it pretty much is a very nice ISO invariant camera. So what does all this really tell us? What does it do? What it means is, when you go out and shoot, especially for astrophotography, low light photography, and you can protect the highlights and then raise the exposure in post-processing and not pay a penalty in doing so. You'd have the same amount of noise as if you shot it at a higher ISO setting. And this is very helpful because now if you want to, let's say, dual process an image, you have your foreground, you've white painted it, it looks really nice, but your sky is the stars are too dark, you can kind of split that up, put a gradient in there or something, and increase the exposure of the stars and bring those up and have a very nice, nice image. So ultimately though, what does this really do? This gives you more knowledge of how your camera system works, because that's what really is important. If you have good knowledge of it, you can understand what the strengths and weaknesses are, and you can work to those and use those to your advantage, and ultimately get better images out of your camera. So I would recommend, no matter what camera system you have, go through this. Even if you have the GFX100s or an X-T4 or both, go through it yourself. Understand and know how those work, because now you can do it. It's not hard, it's fairly easy, and you can really get a better understanding so you maximize the potential and usefulness of your camera system. Hopefully this was helpful. If it was, please, I'd appreciate it if you give me a like, and if you have any questions, please leave me a comment. Leave them in the comments below. I will gladly answer them as best I can. And if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.